And here we are. All right, uh, let's begin. Welcome everybody to Data Dialogues. Our guest today is Madhur Singh, Managing Editor of IndiaSpend. Madhur started her career in journalism while still an undergraduate student. For my students at JSJC, hope you're listening. You too can start your careers as an undergraduate student. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Classes first and then in your break time, right? Uh, Madhur wrote a weekly cultural affairs column for the Indian Express. After graduation, she wrote and edited for the Hindustan Times in Chandigarh and later Delhi. Madhur also worked as a features writer for the Indian Express in Delhi in 2007. She joined Time magazine as its India reporter, covering, amongst other stories, the 26/11 attacks in Bombay. In 2009, Madhur worked as an India reporter for BNA Inc., which is now Bloomberg Law, and the University of Chicago, producing also radio features for Asia Calling and the Voice of America. Madhur has a master's in international relations from the University of Warwick and a master's in English literature with post-colonial studies from Punjab University, Chandigarh. Welcome, Madhur. It is great to have you.
Thank you, Ruchika. It's wonderful to be here, and a big hello to all your students and viewers.
Thank you. So, Madhur, you are part of the faculty of the India School Spend of Data Journalism, which means that we have quite a lot in common. What does data journalism add to the traditional journalism toolkit?
Right. To begin with, I think one of the most interesting uses of data in journalism is to spot story ideas. If you spend long enough and take a critical look at data sets, very often facts will spring up to you that are not very well known and that can lend themselves very well to stories. One recent example of a correction in public perception has been a story that came out of data similarly. For the longest time, all of us have pictured the Indian farmer as a man who's tilling or plowing his field with a bullock cart or a tractor, and his wife. She's the one who brings him food and water at midday. And that's all. That's how we've always pictured it. But if you look at the data show that the majority, more than 70% of women who are working in rural India are working on farms. So suddenly we realize that the Indian farmer is also a woman. That in itself is a story, and a story that a lot of platforms have picked up. But it also gives rise to other investigations. For instance, our policies and programs meant for the Indian farmer reaching the Indian woman farmer, how can they be designed better so that women farmers who are more likely than their male counterparts to not have a title to the land that they're tilling do get these benefits. Also, the question of how can surveys be designed better to capture this reality. Very often women who work in household enterprises, the family business or the family farm, do not even recognize that they themselves are making an economic contribution outside of the household and are therefore employed. Stories of all of that kind can come out of data. That is one aspect of it. The other is, of course, to back up your arguments with facts and statistics to make your argument watertight. And all of us read stories where maybe the story's been told before or not been told before, but the moment there's a fact told in the form of data, the story comes to life. We've been talking a lot about time use, for instance. So let's say you're writing a story on the fact that Indian women are inordinately, disproportionately burdened with housework. You have lots of case studies because it's anecdotally true. We've seen it all over. But then you bring the data point that men spend 2.5 hours doing unpaid work at home and women spend 7 hours, more than twice, nearly as much as a working day of 8 hours. And your argument is watertight. There's no arguing with that story anymore. So that's what data can bring to a story.
Yes, you've highlighted all these issues that are very dear to me actually, because, we're launching our data journalism course, which is the PG Diploma in Data Journalism. we're planning to teach an elective on data feminism, which is to highlight the missing aspects that, you cannot glean very easily, and something that data brings out if you know what you're looking for. So time use data is one of the major things that we plan to introduce in that course. And also, yeah.
I'll share a link with you that you can share with your students later to this data gaps series that we're currently running. And a lot of the gaps in public data have involved women typically. For instance, the last story that I remember from the series that we ran was about the fact that we don't know how much land women own because of the way data is gathered and how definitions are made. We don't even understand how much property, immovable property and land particularly that women own. So I think that's a very worthy investigation that I would take that elective course.
Maybe we can talk more about maybe designing the course, perhaps.
I want to attend it. I'd like to learn from you, learn more. I'm sure there'll be leads for us to follow as journalists.
Tell us a little bit about IndiaSpend and about data journalism at the IndiaSpend, since you guys have pioneered much of the data journalism in our country.
Thank you so much for saying that and for this question. So at IndiaSpend, our effort has been to bring out social sciences research from laboratories and think tanks and into the public domain in an accessible and understandable format so that it informs public discourse and public discussion and debate on policy. Very often when we talk about these things within the team, we find it funny, also awful, that the entire country knows who is Dhoni's wife. But most of us will be hard pressed to say what is India's literacy rate. So, okay, the rate is 74%, but I'd really urge all of your students to go and check the sex segregation of that because it's very wide and it's very interesting. That's one part of what we're trying to do, bring evidence and facts rather than opinion into public discourse. And to that extent, data is central to what we do. We're a nonprofit. We focus on issues of public interest. So environment, education, health, livelihoods, gender parity. These are the kind of issues that we cover. We work mostly with publicly available data sets and, sometimes use them for, to find story ideas or to back up our arguments and stories, but also to point out gaps in public data, like I said, with the series that we do. We also work with data that's been collected or collated by researchers. And sometimes when there is time and bandwidth, we also generate primary data sets. For instance, we last did a series on cancer patients at Tata Memorial, for which we generated, it was a 6-month project for which the survey was designed and original primary data was collected, and that gave rise to several stories, which went on to win many awards. That is essentially what we do at IndiaSpend.
That's amazing. And, I just took your India fact quiz a few days ago.
Thank you. I was going to come to that at some stage. I wanted to talk about it. So that's part of our effort to reach a wider audience, to reach the younger lot with fun facts and, trivia, definitely cricket trivia, but also literacy rates and things like that. And I must say, it is a very interesting format, and I hope it spreads far and wide.
I think it will. I'm going to ask my students to take it and, get in touch about that. I took it myself. I did not get a perfect score. I feel very bad about that. I got a reasonably decent score. But
that's great. That's a distinction. You got distinction. I would probably just get pass marks.
Yeah, it was really great to see. And actually, I'm going to, do it as a class exercise at some point with both the postgraduate diploma course as well as the data analysis course. Gapminder also has similar stuff like, Gapminder Foundation. So it's great to see IndiaSpend, doing this kind of work for an Indian audience.
Thank you. It's very nice. Very nice to hear that.
So, the one of the biggest problems that we are facing is newsrooms are, they want to embrace data journalism, but often they face challenges because of getting people who can write and, do data work and analyze data, as well as, what are the possible challenges that an Indian newsroom would face when they are reporting and editing data-driven stories?
Right. So the challenges I'd say are you've highlighted some of them. As I see them, it's a twin challenge. The easier and the obvious challenge is the fact that we don't have the capacity and the skills to handle and analyze data, and then to be able to tell stories using that data. That I think is the easier challenge to solve because skilling is not that difficult. I think the larger challenge, which is more difficult, is that we lack the width and depth of understanding and knowledge to be able to put the data in context. I'll try and explain that with an example. So let's say we have a data point that Narega pays 300 rupees per day in, say, Haryana. That's very well. But how do we situate this within its larger context? What does the 300 rupees a day mean for the person who's earning it? Is she able to afford 2 square meals a day? Is she being able to send her child to school? Is she being able to meet medical expenses when they arise? Let's go wider than that and then situate it in the state itself. How does that tie in with Haryana's skewed sex ratio, with its low women's participation in the labor force? Going even wider, we can talk about, we can make a comparison with Tamil Nadu, where proportionally a much higher percentage of women are in the workforce compared to Haryana. So nestling a data point and a story within its larger context and bringing to bear all the right background is what makes a story interesting and informative. And that is the challenge that all of us as journalists need to build. It takes years of reading, of studying, of observation of life, and all of these years are largely, in the background, unacknowledged, quiet, which you just do for yourself. And frankly, we can't expect students straight out of journalism school to get it. It takes a lifetime of practice. But I think the key is for journalism schools to be able to tell students, to make them understand that this is where they need to aim to be. So does that answer the question?
Some of it, yeah. I mean, also, I guess, yeah, actually, that is the tough part. While teaching data journalism, I've seen that, the students will learn how to make the visualizations. It's actually not that difficult. And, when suppose they're coding on R, it doesn't take a lot to code, because much of this information is available online. They will take their friend's code, copy it. The coding world is pretty open source and pretty open access. The trick that the where they lack, or what makes the difference between an outstanding submission and something that's just passable, is being able to think deeply about what the data means for society or for whoever they're talking about, and to put it in context and to write about it.
That's right. And, some of it can also be broken down into easier tips. You can create a little checklist for yourself. Um, I'll share a few examples, for instance. Of course, you have to begin with humanizing your data. Just a number story rarely cuts it. What is the human angle? You cannot use numbers alone. You have to make numbers tell the story of people. That's point number one. The second is to contextualize each important number. If there is a number central to your story, you have to put it in context. And what do I mean by that? You make a comparison or add some information that helps the reader understand what that figure means. So if you're saying, rainfall fell short by XX millimeter, how much is that enough to irrigate? What size of farmland would that irrigate, for instance? I already gave this example of 300 rupees of, wages as Narega. What is 300 rupees for somebody who's living in a village in Haryana? What can they buy with it? What can they not buy with it? So you contextualize your larger numbers. And then, there are some things which come with practice. First of all, do as much research as possible. Also bring in as many perspectives as you can. There's always, let's say, an economic story, but it can also have a political economy aspect. It can have an international business concept aspect. It can, involve women more than men. It can have a religious aspect or a regional difference. So try and enrich your story with as much background and contextualization as you can. And of course, then the rest depends on how well you're able to write it or present it. There's no easy answer, but all of these are things that we look for in good copy. And, frankly, this is what we spend most of our time on as editors.
Yeah. We're trying to teach about editing data stories. A colleague of mine developed 7 tips called the 7 Samurai of data editing.
Oh,
it's pretty cool. But he highlights many of these issues as well, like how a number by itself does not make any sense. You have to see it in context of what that number means, what it can do, how does it relate to other numbers. And I think at some level, converting numbers to pictures has a particular role in that sense. So visualization, most people don't really understand numbers, but they understand pictures very well. Right.
That's correct. I was just thinking, among all this, there's been a lot of talk about net zero targets in climate change lately, right? And a lot of climate stories are also data stories, and so many numbers are bandied about. 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in average global temperatures, 40 million tons of emission saving. And frankly, none of that is easy to relate to because those stories are not being written. And there are ways of telling stories in a more human manner, all these stories about forest fires, for instance, there is a tentative connection with climate change, but just a story that says yahan bhi aag lag gayi is obviously lacking in context. But then imagine a story that maybe begins with a person who can relate their childhood growing up in, say, Kasauli, relate how when they were a child, just 20 years ago, the Bauli at the bottom of the hill had water all through the year, that there was snow-capped mountains in the horizon, even in peak summer, that the fire season didn't start until mid-May, whereas now the forests the hills are on fire at the end of March. And then bring in your data to examine how have annual average temperatures increased, how has the rainfall pattern changed, are there more single days of intense rainfall and many days of no rainfall at all? Is average rainfall much lower than it used to be? And and then come into the story about forest fires, and that's a story we'd all like to read, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's equal parts skill and equal parts art.
Exactly. So when you're reporting with data, I mean, you just brought this out in your previous, as you were saying, when you're reporting with data, how do you get the story? How should journalists go and find out, how do is this worth telling a story about? What are the storytelling, the data crunching skills that the data journalists of tomorrow need?
Okay, so I will talk primarily about the written word because that's the format I'm most comfortable with. A lot of it has to do with writing skills and imagination, curiosity, empathy. So I would begin by emphasizing that you have to be a good writer, and it need not necessarily be something you are born with. You can develop. It's a talent you can hone. It's a skill you can develop. Read a lot, read widely, read deeply, and read carefully. See how others are practicing their skill. If you find, for instance, currently the Knight Center is conducting a very large program for data journalists and for health journalists to report on COVID vaccination. And one of the first modules they had was about testing how well you're able to de-jargon and explain difficult concepts. Sometimes those concepts are fairly basic, like what is the mRNA technology, and how well are you able to explain that? So what we do at IndiaSpend is we picture an intelligent 15-year-old and try and explain concepts to that person. If your intelligent neighbor's 15-year-old daughter can understand what you're writing, it should cut it. So yeah, learning to write well is part of it. And then, like I said, to be a journalist of any kind, you have to be curious and you have to develop your empathy. It's not always innate. Of course, some people might be more empathetic than others, but it can, with years of discipline and practice, you can become the sort of person who really cares and is curious to to find out what's the truth, even at the cost of looking stupid or at the cost of putting yourself in danger. So that's what it takes to bring a whole story together.
Of course, much of what we are talking about today, Madhur, they're all taught in data journalism and online journalism courses around the world. Paul Bradshaw in the City University of Birmingham, he has a course. He has a course on online journalism, and he has a set of classes which he calls empathy as an investigative tool. So as you said, this can be taught, and he uses concept maps where he locates his students in a particular situation and then asks them, okay, how will you get the story? What will you inquire into? So it's really great what you're saying. We have a question, quite a few questions actually for the from the audience. Uttaran Dasgupta, my colleague, author of the Seven Samurai of Data Writing, really? And author of many other things actually. He's author of Ritual, and he says, thank you for an interesting conversation. It was very interesting to hear the points about context. My question, you said a journalist should get as much context as possible. How does one accommodate an opinion that's contrary to the conclusions we have arrived at through our data? For instance, in Uttarakhand, there is enormous data about the effect of ecological changes, but there is also a clamor for development for which there is an ecological cost. How do we accommodate this contradiction between the clamor for development and the clamor for preventing climate change and protecting the environment?
I would say we must, because, well, and this is not just to say he said and she said and kind of, objective distance in journalism. That's not why, but, all sorts of contrary views will enrich your story. And in fact, the best reportage that has come out of Uttarakhand after the floods on Chamoli have taken note of the fact that the state needs to develop. And to what extent has it put economic development ahead of ecological sustainability concerns? And I think it's important to raise those issues. If I were writing the story, or if I were editing a story that someone sent me, and there are no contrary views, I'd be very surprised. I would question why. That would show me that they haven't really done their homework. There should be contrary views, and you don't have to reconcile every contradictory views. We have to learn to live with disagreement, agree to disagree. But it is important to take note of arguments that are valid and supported with evidence, even if they don't agree with the evidence that you have at hand. I'm sure there are tricky cases, and I'm sure all editors deal with it on a case-by-case basis. There's no blanket answer to this, but I would say that the more the views, the better the story is.
Great. Thanks a lot for this one. We also have a question from our student Shardul Srinath. He's also the cultural secretary of the Student Council, and one of the students who's been very interested in data journalism. He says, I realize what my data stories have been lacking all this while. context. So Shardul's actually written for First Draft, and he produced this map of India, which has various. It basically has NCRB data where he represents where the most rapes are happening and so on.
Wow.
He says he's been lacking context, so he's getting very introspective. He says he's curious to know the kind of stories that you would like that you write, and if you can talk about some of your own stories.
Yes, in Shardul, you said his name is?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi Shardul. I would really urge you to check out IndiaSpend series from Bangalore, where I think we did something similar to what you're doing now. We found out crime statistics from across police stations in Bangalore and overlaid that with a map of the city to see what kind of crimes are taking place in which parts of the city and at what times of the day. Some of the findings were absolutely eye-opening, and showed us how much more we needed to delve deeper to understand what is really going on. I'll give you an example. We found that sexual crime was getting reported at midday, past midday in the afternoon. Now, obviously, there's a difference in the time when it's taking place. The time crime is probably taking place and when it's being reported. Also, the affluent areas had more reporting of sexual crime. Now, could be many reasons behind that. Also, we discovered, and this had a very simple explanation, but it kind of made our eyes pop when we saw this fact in the data, that the maximum crime of any kind happening anywhere in the country was in a ward in Bangalore. And we didn't understand what that was about. And eventually it just turned out that it was a very large ward. So proportionally, the crime wasn't that much. It was just, absolute numbers were very high. And subsequently, that ward was actually broken up into 2 police stations. And I think that kind of solved the data problem. So we're always on the lookout for stories. We've done data gap stories on this, for instance, how crime reporting is way inadequate. Also, how various data sets, NCRB data can be very different from BRD data. Stories basically, how would you approach a rape story where you can't speak to a survivor or at least can't know them? It's a tricky question that journalists have always had to deal with. But with data, there are many other lines of investigation that open up. And then, as long as you approach it with an open mind and don't try to follow a template, you'll be surprised what you can do, what kind of stories you can come up with.
That's great. Madhur, for you, what are your top 3 favorite data-driven stories in Indian and in international press?
It's very hard to say. I should have spent a lot more time thinking about this, but actually the name that comes most easily to mind is the Panama Papers expose for the sheer amount of data that they were able to crunch and the cross-border collaborations, just the fact that they were able to keep it all secret for the entire duration of the project. And then the impact it had, it's had so much, the ramifications have been so vast for how international taxation has worked, how international financing is scrutinized and regulated. It's had a huge ripple effect. So that's one of my favorite stories. There's also a very interesting book, several books written on it. It's really instructive for data journalists to read them. If I may indulge myself a bit, I've been very proud of some of our COVID coverage, which Rukmini S, one of India's best data journalists, has written. She's done a whole series of stories examining COVID data and the lack of COVID data in India. The stories have been fantastic. I also really like, and there I go again, I'm plugging our coverage again, but I really like our Women at Work series. For the fact that it's been able to highlight and tell interestingly and intelligently facts that have been staring us in the face all the time. The fact of the domestic work or the burden of time use, for instance, and stories of that kind, which we all know anecdotally to be true, but which haven't been brought out powerfully and strongly and backed by evidence. So yeah, those are some of my favorite stories. Sorry to
Top three.
India spent.
You can go beyond top three.
Right.
Yeah. Rukmani actually launched our data journalism program.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. She's bringing out a book, in fact. I'm really looking forward to reading it. It comes out sometime in September. It's the story of India told through data.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, sounds very interesting.
Sounds like good teaching material. To me, everything is good teaching material. Um, yeah, you also mentioned, the Women at Work series and Rukmani's data, COVID-19 data coverage. Apparently, India's COVID data is also being produced in covid19india.org as an open source, open access kind of project where, because of the lack of official figures, we've had to rely on civil society to come together and bring information to the table, which we are now able to crunch. So that's also creating a public good.
That's true, and it's been so useful for so many journalists. We're a very tiny team, and we're a non-profit, but we did try to run a COVID tracker for several months. We did run it when the crisis was at its peak, until almost everybody was running a tracker, and it didn't make sense for us to utilize the few resources that we had in tracking the data rather than telling stories with it. But ever since we stopped running our own tracker, COVID, the database you've mentioned is the one that we've been following for all of our stories. They've been very consistent, and they've won a lot of respect. Very, very useful.
Yeah. It's great to see. We are developing visualizations on the basis of COVID-19 data now. So it would be good to use this open access public good that so many journalists have come together and created. So, now that we're talking COVID-19, this pandemic has really brought on several challenges. However, it has also established the importance and the relevance of journalism today. Journalists have been established as frontline workers. Data has been established as a news source that brings trust. How do you see the future of journalism and the future of data journalism?
Yeah, so I'm going to indulge in some black humor, but actually, COVID was the biggest boost that data journalism could have ever received. I don't know if in India we would have been having these conversations about data journalism even in the next 10 years had it not been for COVID. Suddenly everybody woke up to the need for data, of accurate and timely data and in formats that can be used, and of people who can use that data, understand it, and use it to tell stories. Hold the powers that be accountable with that data. So it's been a great time to be a journalist. I believe COVID is the biggest story of our lifetimes, like all of us living journalists today. And data journalism has really been central to the coverage of this story. Going ahead, obviously data journalism is not going to be the only game in town, but I can say very confidently that every kind of journalism, every kind of story could benefit from using data and will going ahead. So everybody who's studying journalism and data journalism is doing the absolutely right thing right now.
Yeah, I found it's interesting that we say that that the pandemic has established the importance of journalism. However, a lot of journalists are also losing jobs. There's a lot of terrifying data on journalism job losses. So how does this go together where journalists are established as more important than ever, data journalism is established as more important than ever, but at the same time, there are so many job losses?
Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer, Ruchira. uh, okay, and I'm doing a bit of crystal ball gazing here. And also, I happen to be an optimist, sort of a romantic optimist. So I believe the cycle will run its course, and we will come back to a stage where we realize the value in journalism, where we realize that getting all of our news off of Twitter is not sustainable or good for society in the long run. Um, in India, we've hardly ever had to pay for news. I remember as a student in England that having to buy one copy of the Financial Times would set you back by 3 days of your morning coffee, and it cost a bomb and was very expensive. Hurt a lot to buy it. But in India, we've never really paid for news. Your Hindustan Times subscription would come for the entire year for some 300 rupees, and you'd also get a Parker pen free with it. So we've just been for too long not used to paying for news, and we don't realize that, especially today with so much online media, that when you're not paying for news, you are the product, because those who are bringing you that content are paying for your time and your mind space. And who does that serve? It's clearly not serving you. This is how you go into the rabbit hole of clicking on a story about, let's say, where is Chanderi produced in India, to Fab India stores, and then that leads you to some other shopping website, which leads you down another, some influencer somewhere saying, wearing that sari and showing off, and and before you know it, 2 hours are up, right? And what have you really gained from it? You've probably not answered the question that you started with: how is Chanderi woven, or where is it produced, right? So I think we'll all come back to where we see the value in journalism again. In the meantime, I also feel, and this is coming from personal experience, I quit Time magazine and then joined this subscription-only service, which was BNA Incorporated. And their model is somewhat like, I would say, the Economist or the Financial Times, who are so certain that their content is needed and wanted that people will pay for it. So these publications are confident enough to put most content behind a paywall. So there is always demand for top-notch journalism. When you're doing something really, really well, at the cutting edge of your profession, that has a value. Secondly, content that people really need. So for instance, BNA was a publication that was read mostly by law firms, government organizations, and research organizations based in North America. So they wanted to know, for instance, what is India's environmental policy? How is India's medicine patent policy evolving? What is the latest in India regulating competition and antitrust, with these large Amazon of the world, and the Googles and the Alphabets. So that kind of news, which is of use to somebody, also has a viewership and people will pay for it. That is not to say that you needn't get into the kind of journalism that no one's yet paying for. For too long we've had, Twitter, Instagram is a shining example of this. You create a makeup tutorial and you have 2 million views, and you talk about climate change and you probably have 500. And you talk about malnutrition and you probably have 50, and 5 of them are your family. So like I'm saying, I'm hoping and I'm holding out for the day when journalism becomes a viable profession again. There's been so much positive news coming out of Australia, for instance, where Google's agreed to pay, Facebook has agreed to pay news organizations for their content. And I think the tide is beginning to turn. We might just remember this year as the tipping point when things started to get better again. So yeah, fingers crossed.
A good, very hopeful note for our students. Maybe yeah, I think that's what it was meant to be. So you're basically saying that the subscription model is something that might work. And
yeah, it doesn't work for all kinds of content. For instance, if you see The Guardian, people will subscribe because they get a variety of content from around the world. So there might be lots of very hard-hitting stories on climate change, but there will also be stories about lifestyle and movies, book reviews, restaurant reviews. And so that is something that will probably be easier for you to promote on a subscription module. Would people pay to read IndiaSpend stories? I'm not very sure. Because like I said, there's a certain kind of content that gets viral very quickly, that catches everyone's fancy very quickly. But for certain kind of stories, you really need to appeal to people's conscience. that this is also important. So please read us. So yeah, I agree that subscription is a good model ahead, but will it work for everyone? I'm not sure.
It's yeah. What was the word that Jill Abramson uses? She calls it luxury porn. Uh, yeah, as opposed to what really challenges your conscience. Yeah, and so then the philanthropic model then for India Spend kind of journalism.
Yes. Yes, we've been lucky in getting funding from some of the most conscientious corporates out there who've left our editorial line entirely independent. And yes, that's been a good model. In fact, IPSMF, they've literally helped every online publication that's noteworthy today get off the ground. So that's emerged as a very powerful model in India.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's good to know. Thanks, Madhur. This has been a great conversation, and we've talked about so many important things. We've talked about how to make conscientious journalism possible and viable through business models. We've talked about the subscription model and how and what kind of journalism it can promote. We've talked about COVID-19 data, about India Spends data. For everybody who hasn't taken the India Spend fact quiz, I will send it to you and make you take it. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's been a delightful conversation. I hope to carry on staying in touch with you, your faculty, your students, maybe do some interesting projects together.
Okay. Thanks so much, Madhur.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.